On the desk, it didn't look dangerous, just paper, typed lines, a studio name, a salary figure, a place for a signature. But before Marilyn Monroe became the woman in the white dress, before the flashbulbs, before the posters, before the whole world learned how to say her name, there was a contract sitting inside 20th Century Fox. And that contract didn't just open a door for Norma Jeane. It started closing one too. Because old Hollywood didn't only hire actors, it shaped them, it renamed them, it dressed them, photographed them, corrected them, sold them, and then told the world which version was real. Norma Jeane walked in as a young woman trying to be seen. The studio saw something else, a face, a figure, a possibility, a name they could polish until it no longer sounded like the girl who signed the paper. That's the part people miss. Marilyn Monroe wasn't born under a spotlight. She was built line by line, inside rooms where men in suits decided what America would want from her. And once that paper had her, the question became painfully simple. How much of Norma Jeane was Hollywood willing to leave behind? And before we open that first studio door, take a second to like this video and subscribe. The paper itself was not dramatic. That's what makes it harder to look away from. Marilyn Monroe's first motion picture contract with 20th Century Fox began with the kind of language Hollywood knew by heart. Dates, salary, studio rights, screen tests, options, and signatures. According to Christie's archival listing, Norma Jeane signed a 6-month agreement with 20th Century Fox on August 24, 1946, after a screen test earlier that month. With help from studio executive Ben Lyon, she would soon choose the name Marilyn Monroe, Marilyn after stage star Marilyn Miller, and Monroe from her mother's maiden name. On the surface, that sounds like the start of a dream. A young model gets noticed. A studio offers her a contract. A new name begins to form. A life changes. But old Hollywood had a way of making dreams look clean on paper. Because when a studio signed a young actress, it didn't only pay her. It began shaping her. The hair, the voice, the walk, the photographs, the lessons, the image, even the name that would sit above theater marquees. And for Norma Jeane, that name would become so bright that one day people would forget there had ever been a girl standing behind it. So keep that contract on the desk for a moment. Because at first, it looked like proof that Hollywood had finally opened the gate. But hidden inside that opening was the first quiet question of her career. Was Norma Jeane being discovered? Or was she being replaced? By the end of this story, that contract will not feel like a career document anymore. It will feel like the first set of bars. Not because it gave Norma Jeane nothing. It gave her something real, a studio lot, a screen test, a new name, a chance to step into a business most young women could only watch from the outside. But that is what makes the contract so painful. The cage did not arrive looking like a cage. It arrived looking like a dream. For a young woman who had already known instability, being chosen by a major studio must have carried a powerful kind of hope. Someone had noticed her, someone had opened a door, someone had put her future into print. But Hollywood was never only asking who Norma Jeane could become. It was asking what parts of her could be changed, polished, softened, brightened, and sold. That is why this paper matters. Because the contract did not simply mark the beginning of Marilyn Monroe. It marked the beginning of a question she would spend years fighting to answer. Could she become a star without losing the woman who signed her name first? Before the contract, Norma Jeane had already learned how quickly life could change. She had been a factory worker during the war. Then a photographer noticed her. Then modeling work followed. One picture led to another. Her hair changed. Her poses changed. The camera began finding her before Hollywood knew what to do with her. But a photograph was not the same as power. A model could be looked at. A contract meant she could be shaped. That was the difference. When Norma Jeane entered the Fox system in 1946, she wasn't stepping into the soft glow people later attached to Marilyn Monroe. She was stepping into a machine with rules, schedules, lessons, tests, and decisions, already waiting. The studio didn't just ask whether she could act. It asked whether she could become something the public would buy. So she learned. Acting, singing, dancing. The little rituals of the lot. how to move in front of a camera, how to wait, how to be corrected, how to look grateful while a room full of people discussed what needed changing. And then came the name. Norma Jeane Dougherty was not the name the studio wanted on a marquee. It sounded too ordinary, too married, too close to the girl she had been. Ben Lyon helped suggest Marilyn. Monroe came from her mother's side. Together, the name had rhythm. It had shine. It sounded like someone the camera could love. But names are strange things. A new name can feel like permission. It can also feel like a warning. Because once the studio had Marilyn Monroe, it no longer had to explain Norma Jeane. It could begin building the version it preferred, the smiling blonde, the promising newcomer, the girl with a look that could be softened, brightened, dressed, tested, and moved from one small role to the next. Her first Fox appearances were tiny, bit parts, glimpses, the kind of screen time most viewers would never remember unless they came back years later searching for the beginning of a legend. But that is exactly why this part matters. There was no instant crown, no sudden full-room applause. No one looked at those early pieces of film and saw the whole future. Instead, there was a young woman under contract, learning the system from the bottom, while the system quietly learned how much of her it could rearrange. And for a while, Hollywood's answer was cold. After a brief renewal, Fox let her contract go. The door had opened. Then it closed. But Norma Jeane had already seen enough to understand something dangerous. The studio could reject her, rename her, reshape her, and still not fully erase the hunger that had brought her there. So the first contract didn't make Marilyn Monroe overnight. It did something slower. It taught Norma Jeane how Hollywood worked. And once she understood the machine, she would spend the rest of her career trying to survive what it wanted from her. It is easy to look backward now and think the name explains everything. Marilyn Monroe. 2 words so famous they almost stopped sounding like a person. But in 1946, that name was still new, still being tried on, still sitting on paperwork, call sheets, studio notes, and small roles that did not yet know they were connected to history. And underneath it, Norma Jeane was still there, not as a secret, as the whole person. The woman learning how to stand beneath lights, the woman taking direction, the woman listening when other people told her what needed changing, the woman trying to turn a chance into a career before the chance disappeared again. That is the quiet thing about becoming an image. It does not happen all at once. It happens in small corrections. A name changed here, a hairstyle adjusted there, a photograph approved, a voice softened, a role assigned, a contract renewed, then dropped. And little by little, the public begins to meet someone polished enough to sell. But the person underneath still has to go home with the cost. The real pressure did not arrive when Marilyn was unknown. It arrived when she became valuable. That is what makes this part of the story so strange. The more famous she became, the less ordinary that old contract felt. In 1953, the studio image finally worked exactly the way Fox wanted it to work. Niagara gave audiences the dangerous version. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes gave them the musical comedy fantasy. How to Marry a Millionaire placed her beside Lauren Bacall and Betty Grable, and proved she could hold the screen with women who already knew how Hollywood power felt. The posters grew brighter, the crowds grew louder. The name Marilyn Monroe began selling tickets. But paper has a cold memory. A contract does not blush when a star becomes famous. It does not automatically become fair because the audience has fallen in love. It sits there with the same clauses, the same control, the same studio rights, waiting to remind the person behind the image who still has the final say. And that is where Marilyn's glamour begins to look different, because from the outside, she seemed to have everything Hollywood could offer. The gowns, the songs, the magazine covers, the men turning their heads, the studio machinery working around her, like she was the prize. But inside that system, Norma Jeane was still fighting a quieter battle. She wanted better roles. She wanted stronger material. She wanted the chance to be more than the blonde who made the room laugh. Before anyone asked what she understood. That was not vanity. That was ambition. And ambition was dangerous when it came from a woman the studio preferred to package as simple. Fox knew how to sell Marilyn. That part was easy. What it did not know or did not want to admit, was that Marilyn herself was watching the business just as closely as it was watching her. She saw the distance between what she was earning and what she was worth. She saw the distance between the part she was being handed and the actress she was trying to become. She saw the smile becoming useful to everyone except the woman wearing it. And now the contract on the desk had changed. It was no longer just the paper that had opened the studio gate. It was the paper standing between Marilyn's public value and Norma Jeane's private future. The studio could put her under lights, dress her in satin, and send her out as the face of a fantasy. But behind the fantasy was a worker reading the fine print, a woman beginning to understand that being adored by the public did not mean being respected by the system. That is the trap. Fame can make a person visible and still leave her unheard. And for Marilyn, the louder the applause became, the more clearly she could hear the lock turning inside the contract. People saw the photographs. That was the easy part. They saw the blonde hair, the bright mouth, the gowns, the careful lighting, the way Marilyn could make a still image feel alive. They saw the version the studio knew how to sell. And because that version was so powerful, a lot of people made the mistake Hollywood wanted them to make. They thought the image was the whole woman. But cameras are strange things. They can catch the curve of a smile and miss the thought behind it. They can make a costume unforgettable and miss the person waiting to take it off. They can freeze a woman at the exact second she looks most desirable and still miss the question she is carrying into the next room. And by the time Marilyn had become a star, that question had grown harder to ignore. Who had the right to decide what she was worth? Not what the poster was worth. Not what the studio could earn from her name. Not what the public wanted to see from the blonde on the screen. Her, the woman under contract. The woman still expected to show up when the studio called. Even if the role made the cage smaller, that is where the paper on the desk begins to darken. Because the cameras could make Marilyn look free, but the contract could still tell Norma Jeane where to stand. Then came the role that made the paper feel less like a promise and more like a wall. The girl in pink tights. To the studio, it was another assignment. Another musical. Another way to place Marilyn inside the kind of bright, controlled entertainment Fox believed audiences wanted from her. To Marilyn, it was something else. A sign that even after the huge success of 1953, the studio still wanted her moving in the same narrow lane. The same playful blonde image. The same kind of parts that made money while asking less from her as an actress. And this time, she did not simply smile and step into costume. She refused. That refusal mattered because it changed the contract from background into battlefield. Until then, those pages could sit quietly behind the glamour. They could hide behind premieres, photographs, studio publicity, and box office numbers. But when Marilyn said no, the fine print came forward. Fox suspended her. That is what the contract allowed the studio to do. It could reward her when she obeyed the machine. It could punish her when she tried to step outside it. And for a woman the public thought was floating through Hollywood on diamonds and applause, the truth underneath was much harder. She was a star who could fill theaters, but she still had to fight for the right to choose better work. That is the painful turn in this story. The contract had once looked like the paper that brought Norma Jeane into the studio. Now it looked like the paper that could keep Marilyn trapped there, not trapped in poverty, not trapped in obscurity. Trapped inside a version of herself that had become too profitable for the studio to loosen. That is a different kind of cage. A softer one. From the outside, a crueler one from the inside. Because the world was not rejecting Marilyn. The world wanted more of her than ever. The problem was that it wanted the version it already understood. The smiling, breathy, beautifully managed version. The version that could be printed on posters and placed in musicals and sold back to the public again and again. Norma Jeane wanted something more difficult. She wanted to be read carefully. She wanted people to notice the work behind the image, the timing, the discipline, the study, the hunger to grow. She wanted to stop being treated like a studio invention and start being treated like a serious actress with a voice in her own career. So when Fox suspended her, it could have looked like discipline. But in the deeper story, it was exposure. The paper had revealed itself. It did not simply say, "We believe in you." It said, "We control the terms of your belief." And Marilyn's answer, quiet but firm, changed the direction of her life. She did not run back into the same room and ask to be forgiven for wanting more. She stepped away from Hollywood's grip and turned toward New York, toward study, toward people who might see something in her that the studio kept reducing into a type. For the first time, the contract was not only something holding her down, it was something she was preparing to challenge. And that is where the real surprise begins. Because the woman Hollywood kept selling as simple was about to make one of the smartest business moves of her career. New York did not look like escape at first. It looked colder than Hollywood. No palm trees outside the studio gate, no Fox lot humming around her, no carefully managed sunshine on a soundstage. Just winter streets, hotel rooms, photographers, lawyers, acting rooms, and the strange silence that comes when a famous woman steps away from the machine that made her famous. But that silence mattered. For the first time in years, Marilyn was not only waiting for the studio to decide what came next. She was deciding what came next. That is why New York becomes such an important room in this story. Not because it magically fixed anything. It did not. The pressure followed her. The headlines followed her. The old image followed her too. But in New York, Marilyn had space to do something Hollywood had rarely allowed her to do in public. She could be serious. She could study. She could think about acting without someone reducing it to a costume fitting. She could sit in rooms where craft mattered more than publicity stills, where the question was not only how her face caught the light, but what she understood when she spoke a line. That was the part Fox had underestimated. The woman they kept placing inside the same narrow image was not running away from work. She was running toward better work. And then she did something that did not fit the joke people kept making about her. She built a company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. With photographer Milton Green, she placed her own name on business papers in 1955 and made herself president of a production company. That one detail still carries a quiet shock. Because the woman Hollywood liked to sell as soft, simple, and manageable was now sitting inside a business structure that said something very different. She was not only the product. She was trying to become part of the power. That does not mean she suddenly controlled everything. She did not. Fox was still Fox. The studio system was still huge. Contracts, lawsuits, negotiations, public pressure, and money still circled her. But the meaning had changed. Before, the contract on the desk belonged to the studio's world. Now Marilyn was creating paper of her own. Company papers, legal papers, negotiation papers. The kind of documents that could force serious men to stop treating her like a pretty accident and start treating her like someone who understood the room. That is the part of Marilyn's story people still miss when they only repeat the image. She knew the image had value. She also knew value meant leverage. And if the old contract had helped turn Norma Jeane into Marilyn Monroe, this new company was her way of saying that Marilyn Monroe did not have to belong only to the studio that named her. In those months, the central object of this story starts to split in two. There is the old contract, the cage, and there is the new paper, the key she is trying to make for herself. That is why the move to New York was not just geography, it was strategy. Hollywood had taught her what could be done to a woman through paperwork. Now she was learning what a woman might do with paperwork of her own. And somewhere inside that shift, Norma Jeane becomes harder to dismiss, not louder, not crueler, sharper. Because the woman the studio had underestimated was beginning to understand that if she wanted better roles, better money, better respect, and a better future, she could not wait for Hollywood to become generous. She had to make it negotiate. Hold that image for a moment. Not Marilyn under studio lights. Not Marilyn in a gown. Not Marilyn smiling for another photographer who already knew what kind of picture he wanted. Hold the quieter image. Marilyn in New York, with papers of her own now. Contracts, company documents, acting notes, serious conversations, and the strange courage it takes to step away from the place that made you famous before the world agrees you're right to leave. Because this is where the contract begins to change again. It is no longer only the thing that trapped her. It becomes the thing she now understands, and once a person understands the shape of a cage, she can begin looking for the weak part in the bars. That is what Marilyn was doing. Not escaping the image in one clean moment, not becoming free overnight, but learning where the power had been hiding all along. And the power had been hiding in paper. And then the paper changed. Not all at once. Not in a neat Hollywood ending where the music rises and every wound disappears, but in the way real power often changes. Through pressure, waiting, lawyers, money, public attention, and one woman refusing to go back into the same old box. By the end of 1955, Marilyn and Fox reached a new agreement. The studio still needed her. That mattered. Her name was no longer just a studio experiment or a pretty face on a contract. Her name sold tickets. Her image had become valuable enough that Fox could not simply treat her like a replaceable blonde anymore. And this time, Marilyn did not return empty-handed. Her new deal gave her more money and, more importantly, more control. Reliable summaries of the agreement describe Fox granting her approval over scripts, directors, and cinematographers, along with the freedom to make films through Marilyn Monroe Productions after completing Fox projects. Turner Classic Movies also describes this as the moment she renegotiated with Fox to assert control over her films, with the right to choose scripts, directors, and technicians. That may sound like business language, but for Marilyn, it was personal, because the old contract had said, "We will decide what you are." The new contract said something different. Not complete freedom, not full safety, not the end of being watched, judged, delayed, mocked, or misunderstood, but leverage. And leverage was something the studio had not wanted to give her. This is where the story turns. Not because Marilyn suddenly escaped Hollywood completely. She did not. Fox still had power. The industry still had power. The image still followed her like a second body. But now, when the studio looked at Marilyn Monroe, it had to see more than a performer waiting for instructions. It had to see a woman who had walked away, built a company, waited out the pressure, and forced the room to negotiate. That is why the contract on the desk looks different now. The first paper helped build the cage. The second paper showed the cage could bend. And there is something deeply moving about that. Because Marilyn was not fighting to stop being Marilyn Monroe. She understood the name had power. She knew what the camera saw. She knew what the audience wanted. What she wanted was the right to decide what else could live inside that name. A serious actress, a businesswoman, a student of craft, a woman tired of being treated like a beautiful accident. And then, in 1956, another official change made the split even sharper. Norma Jeane legally changed her name to Marilyn Monroe. On the surface, that might sound like surrender, as if the studio name had finally swallowed the girl completely. But inside this story, it feels more complicated. Because by then, Marilyn Monroe was no longer only the name Hollywood had handed her. It was also the name she was fighting to own. The same name that had been shaped by studio offices, publicity departments, and contract pages was now being carried by a woman who had learned how to push back. So the question changed again. It was no longer only how much of Norma Jeane was Hollywood willing to leave behind. Now it was something sharper. How much power could Marilyn take back before Hollywood found another way to remind her who still controlled the room? And then came Bus Stop. Not as a glittering victory lap, as a test. If the new contract meant anything, it had to show up somewhere real. Not in a headline, not in a press release, not in a studio smile about a new agreement. It had to show up on screen, in the kind of role Marilyn had been asking for when Fox still wanted to keep her safely inside the old image. Bus Stop gave her that chance. The film was directed by Joshua Logan and released in 1956. It was also the first picture of Marilyn's new Fox contract, according to the AFI catalog. That matters because it means the paper we have been following through this story had finally moved from the desk into the work itself. And Marilyn did something that would have made no sense to the old fantasy machine. She made herself less polished. As Cherie, the nightclub singer at the center of the story, she did not try to look like the untouchable blonde from a studio dream. The glamour was roughened. The singing was made deliberately imperfect. The character did not move like a goddess. She moved like a woman trying to survive with more hope than protection. That choice was not an accident. It was acting. And Joshua Logan saw it. Logan later praised her talent in unusually strong terms, calling her as near genius as any actress I ever knew. A line preserved in TCM's discussion of the film. That quote matters because it did not come from a fan staring at a poster. It came from a director who had watched the work up close, and the critics began to see it too. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times opened his review by saying, Marilyn had proved herself as an actress, a reaction TCM also records in its Bus Stop article. Think about what that means inside this story. For years, the contract had helped shape the version of Marilyn that Hollywood thought it could control. The bright image, the profitable laugh, the beautiful woman who could be placed into a role like a jewel into a setting. But in Bus Stop, the image cracked open just enough for the worker to be seen. Not perfectly, not by everyone, but enough. The woman who had been treated like a studio invention stepped into a role that asked for damage, awkwardness, hunger, insecurity, comic timing, and emotional truth. And suddenly, people who had been trained to look at Marilyn one way had to pause. Because the old joke did not fit the performance. The contract had changed. The role had changed. But more than that, the witness had changed. Now the room could not pretend she had only been lucky. Now someone who had worked with her could say what the studio image had often hidden. There was an actress there, and she had been fighting to be seen for years. After Bus Stop, the story could have been told the easy way. Marilyn wins, the studio learns, the contract changes, the cage opens, but real life was not that clean. What changed was not the whole world around her. What changed was the evidence. After Bus Stop, nobody serious could say Marilyn had only been a studio trick. The performance was there, the risk was there, the work was there. She had taken a role that could have been played as another soft blonde joke and found something rougher inside it. That mattered, but it did not erase the old image. The public still wanted Marilyn. Fox still wanted Marilyn. Photographers still wanted Marilyn. The business still understood her best when she could be placed into a familiar shape, beautiful, funny, desirable, readable in one glance. And Norma Jeane was still trying to complicate that glance. That is why the aftermath of the contract fight feels both hopeful and sad. She had forced Hollywood to negotiate, but she had not forced it to fully understand her. Marilyn Monroe Productions proved she wanted more than better billing. It proved she wanted a hand in the work itself. The company would later produce The Prince and The Showgirl, with Marilyn opposite Laurence Olivier. That alone says something. The woman once treated like a studio-made fantasy had pushed her name into the producer's space, onto the business side, into the room where decisions were made before the cameras rolled. But even there, the struggle followed, because control on paper and peace in life are not the same thing. A contract can give approval rights. It can raise salary. It can change the terms. It can make powerful people answer the phone differently. But it cannot make the world forget the version of you it already enjoys. And that was the harder cage. The first contract told Norma Jeane what the studio wanted from her. The later contract proved Marilyn had learned how to fight back. But the audience, the press, the industry, and even many people around her still kept reaching for the simplest version. The blonde, the smile, the fantasy. The woman who made everything look effortless because effort was not part of the image they had paid to see. That is where the paper trail becomes painful again. Not because it shows failure, because it shows how much strength it took to win even partial control. Marilyn did not passively drift through Hollywood's hands. She studied the system, she challenged it, she left, she negotiated. She returned under better terms. She gave a performance that made critics look again, and still, the old image waited for her. That is the part that makes the contract feel less like an ending and more like a warning. Because sometimes the cage changes shape. Sometimes it even gives you a better room. But it still asks the same question every morning. How much of yourself are you allowed to bring inside? So now bring the contract back one last time. Not as a legal document. Not as a piece of studio history. Not as a collector's item that can be placed under glass and admired from a safe distance. Bring it back as the paper trail of a woman being made, managed, underestimated, and slowly learning how to fight for herself. At the beginning, that contract looked simple. A chance, a 6-month agreement, a young woman's name moving closer to a studio gate. It carried the clean language of business, but underneath that language was something much heavier. It was the first place Hollywood began turning Norma Jeane into Marilyn Monroe, and that is why the contract matters. because it did not only record employment, it recorded transformation. A name changed, an image built, a body photographed, a voice shaped, a career guided, a woman packaged for a world that wanted to look before it wanted to listen. But the story does not end with Norma Jeane trapped under those pages. That would be too simple. And Marilyn was never simple. The deeper truth is that she learned from the very system that tried to contain her. She learned where the power sat. She learned what paper could do. She learned that contracts could close doors, but they could also be forced open. She learned that if Hollywood was going to build a name out of her, then she could fight to decide what that name meant. That is what makes the later contract feel so different from the first. The first one helped create the cage. The later one showed the bars could bend. Not break completely, not disappear, but bend enough for Marilyn to step forward and make the studio answer to her in a way it had not wanted to before. And maybe that is the most human part of this story. Marilyn Monroe did not spend her life only being shaped by other people. She pushed back. She studied. She left. She negotiated. She returned with better terms. She took a role that made critics look again. So Marilyn's studio contract was not just paper. It was the record of a woman trying to take ownership of a name the world kept repeating as if it already understood her. And maybe the cage around Norma Jeane was never only the contract. Maybe it was the world's confidence that Marilyn Monroe was easy to explain. So do not leave her in a headline. Do not leave her in a studio dispute. Do not leave her frozen under the weight of a contract, as if paperwork gets the final word on a human life. Leave her somewhere quieter, a room with soft light, a chair near a window, a script open in her lap, a pencil in her hand, a page marked carefully because she is not posing now. She is working. That is the Marilyn this story has been moving toward. Not the blonde the studio could sell in one glance. Not the joke people thought they understood before she even opened her mouth. Not the fantasy that made everyone else rich while she had to fight to be taken seriously. Just Marilyn sitting with the work, reading the line again, thinking about it, testing where the feeling should land. Trying to find the truth inside a role while the world outside the room keeps asking her to become something easier. There is something tender in that image. Because it does not erase the glamour. It does not pretend Marilyn Monroe was not powerful, beautiful, funny, magnetic, or impossible to ignore. It simply lets Norma Jeane sit inside the frame too. The woman who learned from the machine. The woman who pushed back against it. The woman who knew paper could trap her, but also knew paper could be rewritten. Maybe that is the fairest place to leave her. Not under flashbulbs. Not inside a contract folder. Not as a symbol other people keep using. But alive in a quiet room, with a script in her hands, still asking to be read carefully. And if you want Marilyn remembered this way, carefully, gently, and beyond the image, then stay with us. Like this video if this story helped you see her a little differently. Subscribe if you want more old Hollywood stories told without gossip, without cruelty, and without rushing past the person behind the legend. And tell me in the comments, what is one Marilyn Monroe moment, photo, or film scene that made you feel there was more to her than the world allowed people to see? Not as scandal, not as rumor, as memory. Because Marilyn's story was never only about fame. It was about the distance between being looked at and being understood. And the next time you see that famous face, the smile, the light, the blonde hair, the image that still travels across the world, maybe you'll think for a moment about the paper on that studio desk, the contract that opened the door, the contract that built the cage, and the woman who kept trying, in her own quiet way, to make the world read the fine print.